Well, hello, church history friends. Thank you for joining us tonight as we welcome Tony Chvala-Smith to the spring lecture series. And we hear all about the construction of an RLDS theological identity. The spring lecture series is not only a great way to learn church history and a dash of theology, it's also an opportunity to help support church heritage. Donations received during the lecture series will go to developing new educational programs. It'll help fund the Alma Blair internship program and continue our ongoing support for the maintenance and preservation of all 5 Community of Christ historic sites. Seth will drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chat, and we thank you for your support, friends. I want to introduce you to a few folks that are joining me tonight. Peter Smith is joining us from Central Michigan and is helping out behind the scenes. Welcome, Peter. We also have Seth Bryant joining us from his home in beautiful Kirtland, Ohio. Welcome, Seth. Seth is serving as our host for tonight's program, and I'll turn the microphone over to him for the rest of the evening. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you, Barb. Always love to share church history with you and to take part in these lectures. I'm really excited about this one as well. Tonight's lecture with Community of Christ theologian Tony Chvala-Smith. Now the schedule is in the chat, and we look forward to questions from the audience, which you can post in the Q&A feature that appears at the bottom of your screen. Note that the Q&A feature and the chat are separate, so make sure you're posting questions in the Q&A, and we'll go over those questions once our speaker has concluded his remarks. All right, so let me introduce our speaker tonight. Anthony Chvala-Smith lives in Independence, Missouri. He is Associate Professor and Paul E. Morden Seminary Chair of Religion at Community of Christ Seminary and Graceland University. Tony also serves at the church's international headquarters as a scripture and theology consultant, and he chairs the church's theology formation team. In addition, he represents Community of Christ on the Faith and Order convening table of the National Council of Churches. Tony and his partner, Charmaine Chvala-Smith, regularly work together in their many varied roles for the seminary, Graceland, and the church. So welcome, Tony. Thank you for joining us tonight. The spotlight is all yours as we're ready to hear your thoughts on the historical construction of an RLDS theological identity.
Thank you, Seth. It's really nice to be here and to be able to do this. Doing theology and history together is, for me, a fun thing. So I'm delighted to be able to put the two disciplines together, which is more or less what I do for a living. So this lecture is going to be about how a religious tradition constructed a credible identity in a specific moment. Life, it turns out, is ever about identity construction. And this proves true for communities as well as individuals. One of the most illustrious of modern theologians, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in fact, wrote a poem about identity while in prison in June of 1944. His poem, Who Am I?, was written less than a year before the Nazis executed him for his role in a plot to assassinate Hitler. I'm going to quote here some excerpts from the poem. Who am I? Am I really what others say about me? Or am I only what I know of myself? Who am I? This man or that other? Am I then this man today and tomorrow another? Am I both all at once? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions. Who are we? The period from approximately 1880 to 1910 was profoundly formative of the RLDS Church's emerging theological identity. This was a time of denominational self-definition, in which certain characteristic features of the reorganization would receive decisive shape with positive and negative long-range consequences. So self-definition, what is it? Self-definition refers to a community's or an individual's way of constructing their own sense of self. Self-definition is a process that yields a tentative product. This is who I am for now. In answer to Bonhoeffer's question, who am I? Or the early Reorganization's question, who are we? Self-definition is how one articulates the boundary markers between self and other, between us and them, between I and you. Because existence is fluid, there can be no final or definitively constructed identities. And to imagine that one has finally answered for all time the question, who are we, turns out to be a form of self-deception. Construct, reconstruct, then reconstruct. Lather, rinse, repeat. In living beings and systems, attempts to evade this process imperil the integrity of the living thing itself, which is always in transit. In human experience, certain character traits that were charming in a child may later pose difficulties to the maturation of personhood. I suggest that this is the same for religious communities. In the Reorganization, it was not until the late 1950s and into the 1960s that the negative consequences of a 19th century form of self-definition were keenly felt. As some childhood habits prove notoriously hard to break in adulthood, so it was with the Reorganization in the transformative decade of the 1960s. The church then had inherited and was deeply stamped by an approach to its theology that emerged and flourished in the late 1800s. That 19th century form of doctrinal self-definition would prove less than credible in a church consciously entering late modernity. But what exactly was the earlier form of doctrinal self-definition? This lecture returns to the period from 1880 to 1910, approximately, to explore how the church's theology was articulated doctrinally to construct a distinct reorganization answer to the question, who are we? My interests, though, aren't antiquarian, but theological. Understanding Community of Christ's current theological identity more fully is aided, I think, by exploring that against which we have pushed off, so to speak. Theology students learn from Charmaine and me what I call the Tony Chvala-Smith principle. It goes like this. Every theology is a response and reaction to the theology that came before it. Thus, understanding Community of Christ's current theological identity, which is what I do as a theologian, actually requires that we understand how the church of our ancestors, the Reorganization, constructed its theological identity. So, this lecture then is also going to be about the nature of doctrine. So definition is in order. Let's go to the word doctrine. The English word doctrine is derived from the Latin word for teaching or instruction, doctrina. And I can't think of a better formal definition of doctrine than that's offered by the brilliant historian Jaroslav Pelikan, who died in 2006. Pelikan says the doctrine is, quote, what the Church of Jesus Christ believes, teaches, and confesses on the basis of the Word of God, end quote. Doctrine is content. It's the stuff in the lesson plan that students are supposed to learn. Its foundation, says Pelikan, is God's self-revelation. And by the way, that's actually what that freighted phrase, Word of God, really means. It's about God's self-revelation. So in theology, doctrine is commonly distinguished from dogma. The latter, dogma, being teachings of an official determinative nature on which salvation is imagined to be dependent. Protestants, at least the historic Protestant churches, do not have dogmas, but doctrines and official declarations or statements, which are always viewed as reformable. And so, to jump ahead a little bit, we are very much like that. So in the experimental period, there was this unquestioned assumption, experimental period of our church's history, 1820 to 1844. There was this unquestioned assumption that the gospel, whatever else it was, must be expressed as correct doctrines. These doctrines formed a system that could be expressed, demonstrated, and defended as true, and thus as superior to other systems. Successful reorganization missionaries were those adept at defending this RLDS doctrinal system, as it was commonly understood. And that period was rich with colorful apologists. When I use the term apologist in theology, I mean someone who's a defender of a certain perspective. And so there were lots of apologists, defenders of the reorganization's doctrinal understanding in that period. One of those was Marietta Walker. In his memoirs, Joseph Smith III makes the following observations about Marietta Falconer Wagner. And she lived from 1834 to 1930. Joseph III said this: Marietta, though at first a firm Methodist, became convinced of the truth of the Latter-day Message, was baptized, and became one of its staunchest defenders. At her confirmation, she received marked administration of the Spirit. She was a well-educated woman, and with characteristic zeal and energy became very active in the labors of the church, which she had espoused. She wished to pass on the truth she had received, and in time became known throughout the length and breadth of the church. End quote. That's from Joseph III's memoirs. So the language of this encomium is rich with theological presuppositions from that era. Did you catch it? To be convinced of the truth, to be a staunch defender of this truth, to pass on the truth received. This is the language of doctrinal self-definition, as well as of a community that conceives its identity in doctrinal terms. But how was this truth passed on? In 1888, Walker co-authored with Henry Stebbins a book titled A Compendium of the Faith and Doctrine of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for the use of the ministry and of Sabbath schools. It makes a very long bibliographical entry, by the way. This text was in continuous usage in the church well into the 1950s, and in later incarnations was still available from the church's publishing company for years beyond that. What kind of book is it? Literary genres convey meaning. Thus, a brief exploration of the genre of the compendium, I think, will clarify certain theological features of the RLDS Church in that formative period. It'll also give us a way to understand why the church's much later spiritual passage into what we call Community of Christ was so difficult. So this is the two pictures here. This on your left side is the 1888, the original version of the compendium. It's just really little, quite thin. And then on the right is a 1951 revised edition. Of course, Marietta's not revising it at that point. But the original compendium went through multiple editions and multiple revisions by Burgess, Phillips, Lee, and even Morris Draper. And so this text was constantly there, forming and reforming and reshaping church members' identities. So this text is an example of a genre of religious literature I'm simply going to call doctrinal reference books. The genre proved really popular among church members. The Reorganization published many books in this genre, similar to, or even the same kind of book as Walker's and Stebbins Compendium. Even before this one, which was published in 1888, J.J. Cornish had published one called A Synopsis of the Holy Bible. Well, it's not biblical scholarship we have here, but it's his own doctrinal reference book. It was published in Reed City, Michigan in 1886. And Charmaine, I actually possess a copy of this. That's what this picture is from. It's rather worn, but JJ would, in his autobiography, he says he will make copies of this available to people, I presume for whatever it cost to send postage at that time. So there were other books like this. There was Kelly's Presidency and Priesthood. And then there was Griffiths, the Instructor. Gomer Griffiths wrote this book, The Instructor, subtitle, A Synopsis of the Faith and Doctrine of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in 1893. It was long a standard resource for reorganization members. And this copy here is one that I own. It was my great-grandma Smith's, and it was given from her to my Grandpa Smith and passed on to me by Grandpa Smith. It's really beaten. And one of the things you may occasionally find in these old doctrinal reference books the church members owned, if they still have them, they're full of pen and pencil markings where people were adding additional proofs and different things they had discovered to help buttress their faith. Here's a sample page of Griffith's Instructor. So this kind of resource was just really very common in the church. There were lots of them. There's one by A.H. Parsons, referred to as Parsons' textbook. That was published in Lamoni, also in 1893. And in the preface to that, Parsons says his intent is to be methodical and systematical. And if you like lists and spreadsheets, you will love these doctrinal reference books, because they're kind of set up in a list sort of format. And then in 1914, Alvin Knisley produced his little book, Doctrinal References. And that book was still available from Herald House in the 1970s. In fact, I bought one at my very first reunion in 1976. I was a fairly new member of the church. And knowing only what I learned about the church, I wanted to be able to defend it. And I found Knisley's doctrinal reference book very helpful. I would not find it so today. We'll get to that a little later. So this genre, this literary form, emerged to help missionaries as well as members in local branches defend and teach the faith of the RLDS Church as they understood it then. The books follow typical patterns. They arrange various topics of belief. For example, God, the antiquity of the gospel, spiritual gifts, salvation, ministry, priesthood, etc. Like headings. You can see a heading here, Revelation. And then what they do is they give a variety of biblical references. The references are in the classic form of proof texts, verses that are atomistically selected, I want to say yanked, from biblical books and treated as a divine warrant or justification for particular beliefs or practices. Some of these doctrinal reference books, like Parsons' textbook, give extensive quotes from ancient and other historical authorities to support a specific belief. A common example of this would be evidences that the earliest form of baptism was by immersion. But there are other kinds of examples. For example, in Parsons' textbook, there's a heading called "Frequency of Earthquakes Are Indicative of the Last Days." That's the heading. And Parsons reprints clips from then current newspapers and periodicals describing various global disasters as proof that the end was nigh. Walker and Stebbins, interestingly, end their compendium with a synopsis of history, in which they give some very selective highlights of the history of the Christian church based apparently on a 19th century English translation of Johann von Mosheim's Ecclesiastical History. And Mosheim was from the 17th century, so that book had been around. Mosheim was a Lutheran church historian. Walker included this material in the compendium, she says, as a way to demonstrate the credibility of the Reorganization's belief in the apostasy, i.e. that the earliest Christian church fell away. As is common in all the doctrinal reference books, not only are scriptures cited in proof text style, but what counts as historical evidence is quotes from ancient and some medieval and some modern sources that are cherry-picked without regard to context and with no attention to historical development. So these doctrinal reference books were valuable tools in a religious context that shared certain common assumptions. As one observes in John Cornish's autobiography, in this 19th century setting, Protestants of all stripes presumed that the Bible, essentially the King James Version, was the final standard of authority for all religious truth. They all presumed, additionally, that biblical verses could and must be assembled into a self-evidently true schema. Or you can use the word system. I will use that quite a bit. Further, they assumed that this system of thought that they had articulated represented true Christianity, based on what they supposed was the plain and immediate sense of any biblical verse in English. Indeed, all these thinkers presumed that what the Bible meant was what God meant. And since their system was what the Bible meant, it followed that their system was what God meant. The late 1800s in the North American religious landscape was one of dueling doctrinal systems. So for the creators and users of the doctrinal reference books, and as for their intended audiences, a historical, critical, contextual approach to biblical texts or to the theology of the ancient or medieval or modern church was nowhere on the horizon. They didn't know about that yet. Neither someone like Griffiths nor his Protestant opponents in debates knew anything about the long process of canonization by which the Bible was created. Nor did they have significant or critical knowledge of the development of Christianity. They knew virtually nothing about the complexities of biblical translation, nor about the idea of textual differences that are based on varying manuscript traditions. Their shared assumption that religious truth could only be one thing meant they didn't have a good way to make sense of the theological diversity of the Bible itself. In other words, the Bible says many things about the same topic. Scholars would say the Bible is theologically diverse, but in the context of the 1880s and 90s, people didn't think of the Bible as being diverse. They thought of it as an Instagram post from God, in a sense. And so they didn't have, and they assumed that truth, especially religious truth, could only be a single thing. And so therefore, they did not have any kind of way to manage reading the Bible as a book that says many things about the same topic. And the idea that the Bible was a library of books created by human communities over centuries, and that scriptures are those texts which over time become sacred to or are given authority by a specific community, that would have been utterly foreign to them. Thus, Walker or Cornish, regardless of their differences in education, could not yet entertain the idea that biblical texts had meanings connected to original historical and cultural context. What many of us currently would take for granted, that scriptures are humanly produced writings reflecting the variations of time, place, and authorial perception, that was not imaginable to restoration or reorganization apologists of the late 19th century. It's not in their framework. And we can't fault them for what they could not know. But we can indeed understand them better if we try to grasp the intellectual, spiritual framework in which they operated and in which they wrote these books. In the late 19th century American context, what reorganization advocates needed was to be able to demonstrate that their theological system was logical, coherent, based on the Bible, not to be linked with what was popularly assumed to be Mormonism, and ultimately the right interpretation of the Christian faith. How would the member of some branch of the church, or a missionary preaching a series in a schoolhouse, or an elder debating Baptists and Methodists in a Grange hall, justify and defend reorganization beliefs? How might they defend belief in, for example, spiritual gifts, or in having a living prophet at the head of the church, or the church's ministerial structure, or there's just so many things they needed to be able to defend. And so what they needed was proofs to demonstrate the legitimacy and ultimately the superiority of reorganization faith. For this goal, the doctrinal reference books were highly effective, again, within the shared assumptions of that religious context. But contextually, the proliferation of books in this genre reveals a surprising paradox. And this is a paradox that still irritates seminary students sometimes when they hear it. The reorganization shared, even with its opponents, an overarching framework of thought, a sacred canopy of convictions about the nature of the Christian truth they were fighting about, as well as about the Bible that was the great code of this conflicted religious space. It's easy to look at all the things they argued about and disagreed on. It takes a little deeper dive to see to find their shared framework of understanding. This foundational assumption was inherited generally from centuries of Christian thought, but especially from that period after the Protestant Reformation, typically identified as the period of Protestant orthodoxy. Now you're going to get a little post-Reformation church history here. The Protestant Reformation is in the 1500s, as is the Catholic Reformation. There were two Reformations in that period. But from the late 1500s to the late 1700s, for 200 years, Lutheran and Calvinist churches in Europe moved beyond the deeply existential insights and theological breakthroughs of their founders. In the era of what we call Protestant orthodoxy, the radical discoveries of the founders like Luther and Calvin, Zwingli and others, calcified into complex, fugue-like theological systems, characterized by a kind of inelasticity, really kind of a rigid theological system. Christian truth for Lutherans and Calvinists in the Orthodox period became purely objective, by which I mean it was external. It was objectifiable, like facts or theorems to be proved. Christianity, as well as the divine human encounter itself, was now imagined as lists of right doctrines arranged into elaborate systems. The explosive personalism of Luther, reading Luther's brimming with flexibilities and paradoxes. Well, that becomes Lutheranism, an ecclesial set of propositions arranged like a collection of facts, not so much around Luther's original kind of defining insights, but around what later Lutheran churches created as confessional documents or creeds. Justification by faith alone, which is the liberating discovery that Luther made after years of agonized spiritual questing. Well, that now became, in the period of Protestant orthodoxy, something like the first axiom of a system, an intellectual postulate. It's much more than a vital, life-affirming experience. So, in a sense, in my view, Protestant orthodoxy abandoned a creative tension long present in Christian theology. The medieval tradition had held together two essential but different ideas about the relationship between doctrine and experience. The creative tension was expressed by two Latin phrases. So you get a little Latin lesson tonight too. The two phrases are fides quae creditur and fides qua creditur. The difference is a vowel. The first one means the faith which is believed. The second translates as the faith by which it is believed. The fides quae refers to a body of beliefs, the faith, a collection of doctrines and practices held to be true. The other expression, fides qua, refers to personal appropriation, that is, to my faith as an act of entrusting myself to the one to whom the body of doctrines or beliefs points. So you could say the fides quae is intellectual, the fides qua is relational. Both of these dimensions of faith were imagined in medieval theology, for example, as belonging together. The mystics who were big into fides qua, into the experience of the God behind the tradition, also deeply believed the tradition, right? The fides quae. So, and in imagining that these belong together, what was being said, and is typically was said in Christian theology all the way back, was that Christianity is not anything one wants it to be. It has a content. There is a lesson here somewhere. But knowing and assenting to the content is not the same thing as radically entrusting oneself to the one to whom the symbols of the content point. At the risk of a little bit of oversimplification, maybe a lot, I think Protestant orthodoxy got fixated on the fides quae, on the content, the doctrine, the structure, the system. The Reorganization, like many rival denominations, was aware of the polarity between the fides quae and the fides qua, right? Between doctrine and experience. They were aware of that. But Reorganization's self-definition, like that of other Christian communities in that context, primarily refocused on the fides quae of divine revelation, that is, on the content, especially its biblical source and its believability and its credibility, and believed with other churches in that era that Christian truth was not first existential, but actually first and primarily propositional. Now, by proposition, when theologians use the word propositional here, they're not like, hey, sailor, it's not that kind of propositional. What they mean is propositions as the kind of thing you would find in a geometry problem. In other words, God was imagined as encountering humanity principally in the form of doctrines and beliefs, of intellectual content, conceived as objectively true statements that appealed to one's reason or rationality. One of the ways the Reorganization solidified its own theological identity was in debates with other Protestants. And John Cornish turned out to be quite a prodigy at disputing with Baptists and Campbellites and Methodists and winning. At least in his autobiography, he seems always to win. It would be interesting to explore the other side of the story. But the very nature of a debate on theological issues centered on propositions assumes that there is a right, objective, demonstrably correct final answer to a religious question. This very assumption had been inherited from the period of Protestant orthodoxy in Europe. It had been passed down in American Protestantism all the way. And even in the revival period, even in the Second Great Awakening, which is the period before where I am right now, the period that formed the first phase of our movement, which I like to call the experimental phase. Even in the Second Great Awakening, with its deeply emotional and experiential tint and its own hyper focusing on the fides qua, on you have to have an experience of faith tonight, that kind of thing. There was still, after that, this obsession in American Protestantism with the right propositional understanding of faith, baptism, church order, salvation, and so on. This was the religious intellectual context in which the reorganization came to define itself. This is so important to understand. The reorganization, which is what I joined as a convert in 1975, the reorganization was shaped in a period of a widespread propositionalism in understanding Christianity and Christian truth, and that deeply impacted how the faith of the church was taught, defended, imagined, and also made it very difficult for the child in the 1960s and 70s to start growing up. A propositional doctrinal understanding of faith is evident in Joseph Smith III's complimentary assessment of Marietta Walker that I started with. Walker was convinced of the truth of the Latter-day Message. This language is akin to that of being intellectually convinced of the truth of certain discoveries or certain scientific data or mathematical equations. Joseph Smith III further stated that Marietta Walker wanted to pass on the truth she had received. Right? It's a quantity of stuff that you hand on. On the screen in front of you, bottom left, 1 Timothy 6:20 uses this Greek word paratheke, the deposit, right? So Marietta Walker wanted to pass on the deposit she had received. So notice how different this kind of language is from contemporary Community of Christ language. Our language centers on experimental and experiential meaningfulness, which is a much more subjective construct. In our postmodern context, by the way, often something can only be true if it is first meaningful. And this is totally opposite of the kind of framework that the reorganization apologists are working in. It's not meaningful because it's true. It's true because it's meaningful. And in our cultural context, there's endless kinds of meaningful. And this becomes really problematic. For example, scientifically, it is true that human activity is causing global warming. And yet some people say that's not meaningful to me, so it can't be true. And that creates all kinds of cultural and social and environmental problems. So in other words, we're just in a very different context from the context that the doctrinal reference books were written. So it's not unfair to say that the context of the reorganization and even the earlier experimental period constructed religious identity in an almost opposite way from how the reorganization in the 1970s and 80s and how Community of Christ has done. One recalls the following lines of a Parley Pratt hymn, "When Earth in Bondage Long Had Lain," which comes from the early era, but in the reorganization era, this was a kind of anthem. I think I still know this hymn by heart. We sang it all the time in the 1970s in reorganized churches in Michigan. "When earth in bondage long had lain, and darkness o'er the nations reigned, and all man's precepts proved in vain, a perfect system to obtain." The reorganization believed it possessed a perfect system, having the right precepts, as opposed to those found in other systems. Salvation, as envisioned here, depends on possessing the right beliefs, meaning those that convey objectively correct information about God and salvation and so on. You've got to have the right list. So I think one could hardly find a better example of a propositional objectivist construction of religious truth than what's in those few lines of the Parley Pratt hymn. And by the way, this was also true in the early period of the church, but what I'm focusing on is the reorganization, which is where I think this really takes deeper shape. Furthermore, as Mark Shearer observes in relation to the publication of Joseph Smith's New Translation of the Bible in 1867, W. Blair remarked that because of this Bible, now listen to this, quote, false doctrine must flee before it. Contentions among the priesthood and the saints must fall prostrate with its coming. Points of doctrine hitherto obscure will be made plain. End quote. I mean, Blair seemed to think that if you finally have the right text with the right words in it, we won't disagree about proper baptismal form, as well as we won't disagree about the color of the carpet. And of course, the very existence and form of the doctrinal reference books like Walker's Compendium, they construct a church identity that holds the divine human relationship to be about having right ideas. Indeed, this 1912 Weston preaching chart is the consummate example of a propositionally based system of thought. It's visual, it's quite colorful. This is not the one Charmaine and I own. This is a less finished model, a stripped down model, I guess. The one that Charmaine and I own is quite a bit more elaborate, but it has the 1912 date on it. And the chart is a systematic theology. It's a system of thought. And pretty much everything on it you can find defended in one way or another in the various doctrinal reference books. So this is part of where we've come from. But there's a puzzle. So understanding these theological assumptions beneath the 19th century Reorganization's doctrinal self-definition, it actually clarifies a certain conundrum. The conundrum is this: one has to wonder, how could a community whose president had categorically said in the Temple Lot suit in 1891, quote, "Understand me, we hold that everything which passes through human hands is fallible." How could that community basically believe its theology was a perfect system? Well, they did not detect the inherent contradiction there. And the reason why they didn't is because that's how unquestioned theological frameworks and assumptions work. At a deep level, they work in us, and they simply become the lenses by which we see everything. And we stop even realizing we have lenses on. The unquestioned theological framework that the apologists of the Reorganization used and shared with their opponents held that this is what Christian faith was. It's essentially doctrine, truths, lists, facts. And that's where they worked from. So because that was like the underlying aquifer the church was drawing from for a century, a statement like the one Joseph III made here in 1891, it just did not have the power it should have had or could have had because of the working of that underlying way of thinking. And thus, when we got to the 1960s and 70s and began raising some difficult questions, it became harder than perhaps it could have been, because, to go back to one of my starting images, the child was refusing to grow up. So some concluding things. Is Christian faith an experience of empowerment through Christ, or a matter of having the right list of ideas? Is Scripture a logbook of divinely authored propositions? Or is Scripture itself a messy testament to the drama of the divine-human encounter? Is Revelation about receiving data, receiving information? Or is Revelation more about the formation of a mystery-laden relationship? Are doctrines dropped from heaven? Or are they necessary but tentative identity constructs the church makes as it seeks to interpret its experience of God in ever new settings? Questions like these of the ones that would emerge in the 1960s, when new knowledge and experience compelled the reorganization institutionally to wrestle with its century-long tradition, 100 years of tradition, of defining its identity doctrinally and thinking about its faith propositionally. It's critical to remember that in the late 19th century, the church had theological credibility only if it could demonstrate that its doctrines and practices were based on neatly arranged biblical texts, could be convincingly supported by additional proofs from Christian history, and could be easily defended as the most reasonable and coherent of religious systems. That's what they had to do. That was their struggle and their issue. Thinkers like Marietta Walker and Gomer Griffiths were well matched to that context. Their commitment to the explication and defense of doctrine within a broader Protestant framework helped the reorganization give a tentative answer to the question, who are we? Now, sadly, they didn't think it was tentative, but looking back, it was a tentative answer to the question, who are we? And they did this by helping the church navigate further away from the shadow of Nauvoo and the Mormon boundary. At the same time, their approach to doctrine subtly intimated and reinforced that the church's modes of thought were more at home within Protestant structures. It's more than a little ironic, I think, that many of these same apologists vigorously insisted we, the reorganization, we're not Protestants. At the same time, at the deepest level of their understanding of the Christian faith, they were using Protestant methods, Protestant symbolism, and had a kind of a Protestant framework about what faith was to guide them. All of which leads me to the axiom, by their deep structures ye shall know them. So I may protest I'm not a Protestant, but pay attention to what's really going on below the surface, and we may see otherwise. To conclude, hey, how did that Bonhoeffer poem come out? I think it's actually quite instructive where Bonhoeffer came out in that poem. Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, you know me, O God. You know that I am yours. That, in the end, is the kind of knowledge, whether it's intellectual or existential, that really counts. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Tony. That was incredible. Thank you. All right. And with that, we will bring our history program this evening to a close. Thanks again, Tony, for sharing your research with us. And thanks to Peter and Barb for your contributions. And lastly, we want to share our thanks to you, our friends in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites with your donations. Thank you for your support. And I encourage you to tune in next week as we welcome Michael Wright to the Spring Lecture Series. Michael will be presenting from his home in Italy, which is 7 hours ahead for those in Central Time. So as a result, next week's lecture will begin at 12 noon Central to accommodate the time zone of our guest speaker in Italy. This is a lecture you don't want to miss. Michael's doing some really groundbreaking research on John Avondé, the first Italian missionary in the reorganization. And like the stories we've already heard in the series about Mark Forscott and Charles Derry, Avondé was a convert to the LDS Church in Italy, immigrated to the US, made it to the Utah's Wasatch Mountains, my stomping grounds, and then turned around and headed east back to the prairies of Nebraska and Iowa, then on to his native Italy. It's an intriguing story, so be sure to register and mark your calendars for next Thursday at 12 p.m. Central. And Barb has already dropped the link to the Spring Series page, so be sure to follow that link to register for next week. So until then, take care, everyone, and have a good night. Thank you.